Hi, I'm Bill Walker. I just want to tell you a little bit about my new book, Hair of the Alien, which is subtitled DNA and Other Forensic Evidence for Alien Abduction. I wrote the book basically as a kind of a detailed case study, particularly one that occurred here in Sydney that involved a man by the name of Peter Curry, in which a hair sample was recovered. Rather than just accept the story at face value, we subjected it to forensic DNA profiling analysis techniques, and we really weren't expecting unusual evidence, but we were quite surprised, particularly the biochemists working with me, that we got unusual DNA, both rare Asian mongoloid DNA in the shaft and oddly, rather bizarrely, rare bar scalic DNA in the root of the hair, and also suggestions of this rare CCR5 deletion factor, which confers in people immunity to things like HIV and smallpox, that kind of thing. So it's a pretty interesting hair sample, and the detail of the case, all of Peter Curry's experiences and the whole kind of unravelling of the story is described in the book, along with a lot of case studies and detail from a number of other cases from right around the world: South America, the United States, Africa, Europe, and in England as well. So a lot of territory is covered, and it's been for me really a focusing on the idea that science can shed a lot of light onto the alien abduction subject, rather than being the field of unfocused sort of speculations and no science, etc. Here we've been able to put a bit of a spotlight onto the alien abduction subject and apply some scientific techniques to biological evidence, and surprisingly it's added support to the possible reality of alien abductions rather than detracting from it.
So at the end of the day, Bill, what do you think was behind the actual whole event with Peter Curry?
Well, that's kind of getting into speculation territory, but the hair sample actually lends support to Peter's story rather than detracting from it, and given that, I guess it adds substance to the idea that maybe there are possibly some strange beings that are intruding into our comfortable little reality here on Earth, and from that point of view it sort of argues that maybe there really is something to the whole alien abduction subject.
Is this the first time DNA results have ever occurred with any type of abduction phenomena?
To the best of my knowledge, I've been investigating a lot of cases worldwide and looking through the literature and talking to a lot of researchers worldwide, and yes, this is the first time that DNA forensic profiling techniques have been applied to a biological sample that's been implicated in an alien abduction story.
I hear your book sales are looking pretty good at Amazon.
Well, it certainly seems encouraging. It's pretty hard. Well, people in the industry tell me that reading Amazon is like reading tea leaves, but it's kind of it's up and down like a yo-yo. But I'm getting sales figures like 7,000 thereabouts in a cast of 2 or 3 million books. So I think that's pretty good in terms of Amazon US.
Can we look at the cover?
Sure.
Okay.
It's obviously sort of working on the DNA motif, etc., because that's a primary focus of the whole book, and it's certainly been an interesting journey for myself in terms of researching this.
Where's it on sale at the moment? Which countries, and when will it be on sale in Australia?
It was published in the United States in July. Probably for those outside the United States, it's probably best to go to sort of outlets like Amazon, although from what I understand it will be available in Australia and the UK and Canada, certainly by late August, early September 2005.
Now, could you tell us how odd was the actual DNA results?
Well, extremely odd, because these unusual findings of the Asian mongoloid DNA and the rare bar scalic DNA in the root of the hair, these were fairly rare DNA profiles, and to have both of those present in the one hair sample in itself is quite bizarre. You should be getting the same kind of DNA result no matter where you get it, both in the shaft and the root. This is not an example of this sort of thing called heteroplasmy, where you get sort of small DNA differences, etc., within the same sort of DNA samples, such as hair, that kind of stuff. But it's certainly not an example of that. And so we're faced with a pretty unusual enigma here that we're trying to obviously understand. Obviously it's only one sample. I'd be much more comfortable if we were dealing with dozens of samples like this that either confirm or or disconfirm, I guess, the nature of the results that we're getting. That way we'd have a lot more certainty with this. But it's certainly, to me, highlighting, I guess, the kind of perspective or approach that we should be dealing with these sorts of cases, rather than, I guess, examining them from a non-scientific point of view. We should be sort of really focusing on these sort of kind of cases, because if they are real in any sense of the word, they represent a kind of an assault, and thus I guess the criminal perspective has some sway here, that you can look at it from a forensic point of view and see what comes out of it.
And when you say when the DNA is odd, you're actually saying it's been manipulated. It's been manipulated of some sort, hasn't it?
Well, certainly the biochemists that are working with me argue that it kind of gives evidence to the idea that this is more than just straightforward DNA sequence. There seems to have been a degree of manipulation, and perhaps this sample approximates sort of advanced cloning techniques. So, that's a pretty extraordinary statement, and obviously it's only the one sample, but just in one hair sample we're getting a pretty bizarre and unusual array of DNA results, and this is quite striking from the biochemical point of view.
Now, if you were going to, what would be the weakest part of your whole case?
The weakest part of the whole case? Well, I guess the bizarre nature of the experience is kind of intimidating for a lot of people, because it's an encounter with two unusual looking female beings, etc. People sort of would argue perhaps that we're dealing here with some sort of sexual fantasy, or the fact that Peter Khoury was recovering from head injuries that he received in a job situation, and he was on medication. Again, all these kind of claims, that you have to measure that up against the evidence that comes forensically for the DNA profiling that we did with the biological sample. Those results actually support Peter's story, and so you can't readily dismiss this as sort of a sexual fantasy or a hallucination or hoaxing, etc. I've sort of looked at Peter's story and investigated it, and I've talked to people that are both friends, who were past friends or whatever, people are not supportive of Peter, that kind of thing. I've talked to lots and lots of people, etc., and through it all, basically, Peter emerges fairly credibly in terms of a person who seems to have had some sort of genuine experience. This is not just the only experiences he's had. He's also had earlier abduction experience as well, and childhood experience, and some more recently than this particular experience.
What does that imply? He has a predisposition to that sort of event?
Well, again, that's kind of prejudging and putting the connotation that maybe there's some sort of psychological thing here. I think the benefit of the DNA work that we've done is that it lends credibility to the fact that there might be some sort of physical reality here that we have to face up to and decide whether or not we need to look at this whole field a little bit more scientifically, rather than trying to write it off as a psychological phenomenon or hoaxing or wish fulfillment, all that kind of stuff.
Could you tell us what angle do you think the skeptics will go for attacking your DNA results?
Oh, of course, they'll immediately assume that the DNA work was hopeless and completely done by rank amateurs. The work was in fact done by PhD qualified biochemists, a team of them, and I've been able to check their credentials as well, and these are people that are highly regarded in the field, particularly one of the main biochemists working with me. That they actually have papers published in peer-reviewed biochemistry journals, etc., and highly regarded. So I don't have any concerns about the credibility of the work and the accuracy of the work, but it is only one result, and obviously one is limited to how far you can sort of push that kind of situation.
Is there enough sample to be actually have another DNA extraction, or?
Well, certainly we could probably replicate the work in the shaft. As far as the root's concerned, that's not replicable, because we basically only had the one chance to do the root of the hair, and that's why we did that second rather than first. We wanted to make sure of the result that we got in the shaft. Once we were confident with that, we then proceeded on the same basis with the root sample, but there was only the one root, of course, and certainly the shaft is something that can be replicated.
And contamination cannot explain any of these results, can it?
Biochemists who have examined the protocols that we use and the test methods have generally been fairly impressed with the protocols, etc. They're fairly elaborate protocols, control samples, that kind of thing, washings, etc., that are all fairly standard for this kind of technique, etc. And we model this process in part on the FBI DNA profiling technique that they use for extracting mitochondrial DNA from hair shafts, because hair shafts have been a bit of a difficulty, and the FBI wanted a technique that they could use to get at the kind of evidence that routinely is found at crime scenes, and shed hair and that kind of thing, which quite often doesn't have roots. Fortunately, we did have a root to this hair sample, and that allowed us to do the other part of the work that we wanted to do, and that was both focused on the mitochondrial DNA in the actual root itself, and also nuclear DNA work as well. But because it was a somewhat degraded sample, we had somewhat limited results in that, but nevertheless the whole array of results that we got were really quite surprising, and thus we felt it was worthwhile enough to report more widely in terms of what's potentially going on here.
No worries, Bill. If you've got any more you'd like to add?
Well, I just think people should be looking at this and looking at it as a potential way to look forward and move forward in this subject, rather than get bogged down in kind of all sorts of wild speculations. Here we've got an opportunity to be able to anchor all these kind of speculations in a bit of hard science, so that we can sort of really be looking in the right directions with clues that are being put forward to us by science, such as DNA work, that kind of thing, rather than just sort of wildly going off in all sorts of unproven directions.
Thanks a lot, Bill Chalker.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Just in terms of experiences that I've had, I guess for me, from my own personal point of view, I had a sighting situation that occurred under rather unusual circumstances. I was going to the University of New England. This was back in 1972, September. And I just finished a 4-hour chemistry practical class late afternoon, so we're heading on towards twilight, and the main thing that was on my mind was getting back to the college campus dormitory, to the dining hall, so that we could get there before closing time for the end of the meal time, etc. So I was rushing across the quadrangle of my college campus, and saw two people walking across the quadrangle sort of towards me, and they were both pointing up in the sky, sort of one saying to the other, can you see that? And the other person says, yeah, but I don't want to. And I thought, well, what the hell are they on about? And so I looked in the direction that they were pointing and observed what appeared to be a egg-shaped metallic looking object that gave the impression that it was about at an altitude of about 200 feet. It had pretty large angular size, and it was just moving steadily across above the actual college campus, and its trajectory to me would have meant that I knew that there was a narrow part of the college building that would allow me to run through, and I'd have a completely uninterrupted view right across sort of sports areas and sports grounds, etc. So I knew that if it was an aircraft or a balloon or something like this, given the steady trajectory that it'd have, I'd have a lot more time to look at it. And so I rushed through the laundry part of the building, straight across to the open area, etc., and no object. So I was able to at least intuitively rule out the idea that it was aircraft or balloons or anything like that, and I was subsequently able to check that out as well through the airport authorities, that kind of thing. So whatever it was, I have no idea, but it was certainly intriguing enough for me to suggest that maybe I had seen a UFO.